The year was 1879, and the desert in the New Mexico territory did not know mercy. The sun did not rise, it assaulted. The wind did not blow, it scraped. Even the air itself felt like punishment, dry and hot, as if God had turned his face and let the earth burn unchecked. But for Clara Whitlow, the cruelty did not begin with the land. It had traveled beside her for over a year, wearing the skin of a man she once called husband. Elias Whitlow had not always been hard. There were days back in Missouri when he brought her apples and laughter, when he whispered about new lands and a fresh start out west. But dreams ferment quickly in dry soil. The drought came first, then the sickness of the cattle, then the slow crumbling of the man himself. What remained was bitter, sunburnt, and mean. His eyes no longer softened when they landed on her. They sharpened instead, as if she were the last problem he couldn't solve. Their wagon, their one hope of making it to Santa Fe, broke down 3 days into the desert crossing. The wheel had splintered on a hidden stone like a brittle promise. Elias had kicked it, once, hard, and then cursed the wood, the road, and finally, her. He always came back to her. Useless, he spat. But his eyes weren't on the axle. They were on Clara, sweat-drenched and quiet, her dress clinging to her frame like another weight she had to bear. Clara said nothing. Silence had long become her armor. She had learned to fold herself into it, to survive by not inflaming his temper. But silence did not shield her from thirst, and thirst, out here, was a living beast. The last of the water was rationed unfairly. He drank in gulps, she in sips. And when she dared to ask for more, his laugh had been sharp as flint. "You should learn to be less needy," he said, tossing the canteen back into the wagon. On the third morning, he sent her out to gather kindling. What kindling could be found in a land that devoured everything it touched? She obeyed, because refusal had consequences. She walked into the pale heat, where the horizon shimmered like a cruel joke, and knelt beside a brittle mesquite branch. That's when it struck. There was no sound, no warning, just a flash of motion, a twin sting, and then pain, deep, furious, instantaneous. Her ankle erupted in fire. She gasped and fell backward, clawing at the sand. A rattlesnake, thick-bodied and diamond-backed, disappeared into a crack between the stones, leaving behind 2 perfect puncture wounds and a rising tide of agony. She screamed for Elias, once, twice. The sound scraped her throat. He came, eventually, trudging over with his usual scowl. She showed him the bite. "You have to help me," she begged, the words tumbling. "Suck the poison, cut it, something, please." He didn't kneel. He didn't even blink. Just stared at her leg, then at the horizon, then at her. His face was unreadable. His eyes narrowed like he was doing arithmetic. "Maybe," he said. Then he reached into her apron and took the one thing she still had from her mother, a silver locket with a tiny portrait inside. "What are you—" But he was already walking away. No goodbye, no explanation. Just the sun behind him, casting his long shadow forward like a warning. He took the canteen. He took the last of the money. He left her there, in the sand and silence, to die. And for a while, Clara believed she would. The hours that followed blurred into fragments, heat, pain, a sky that refused to darken. Clara tried to crawl, once dragging herself toward the shadow of a rock outcropping, but her leg throbbed like it had grown its own heart, each pulse a scream. The venom crept upward, slow and cruel, turning her skin to fire and her thoughts to fog. She tried to pray. The words came out dry, cracked like the ground beneath her. "Lord, I don't want to die. Not like this. Not forgotten." But the desert had no ears. She drifted in and out of consciousness, the sun tracing its brutal arc overhead. Somewhere between pain and sleep, she saw her mother's face. Then the face of Elias, twisted not by rage this time, but by indifference. And then, nothing. Jedediah Cain had learned to live without expecting company. His cabin stood at the edge of what used to be a silver claim, nestled between two low hills and guarded by creaking mesquite trees and silence. He was a man shaped by solitude, lean, weathered, the kind of quiet that could either comfort or unsettle, depending on who you were. He had buried his wife Ruth 4 winters ago, after the fever took her in a matter of days. Since then, his days had been measured in chores, not hours: fencing, hauling water, tending a few stubborn goats who didn't know the war was over. He didn't drink, he didn't talk much, and he sure as hell didn't go looking for trouble. But on that particular morning, while riding his southern fence line looking for a downed rail, he saw something strange just off the trail, something that didn't belong. At first he thought it was a bundle of rags or an animal carcass, but there was color to it, flesh tones beneath the dust. He rode closer, warily. Rattlers liked the sun too, and the desert had a way of punishing the curious. Then he saw the movement, the slow rise and fall of breath, a human. Jed swung down from his saddle, every instinct sharpened. He approached slowly, boots crunching on sand and stone. It was a woman, barely more than a girl, really. Her face was blistered from the sun, her lips cracked, her dress torn at the hem and stained with blood and dust. One arm lay across her brow as if shielding her from something she no longer had the strength to fight. But it was her leg that caught his breath. The ankle was grotesquely swollen, the skin dark and taut. He knelt, gently lifting the edge of the dress. 2 puncture wounds, mean and black, wept fluid into the fabric. He knew that pattern, knew the danger, knew the clock was already ticking. "God Almighty," he muttered. He looked around. No wagon, no supplies, no man. Whoever had left her here, if someone had left her to die. Jed had seen enough death. He wasn't about to stand by and witness more. He took a knife from his belt, a blade well kept, not out of fear, but habit. Then, with steady hands, he made 2 shallow cuts across the bite, just enough to break the skin and pull the poison. He worked quickly, grimly, spitting into the dust after every draw of blood. The taste was foul, metallic and bitter, like rust and venom mixed. When he had done all he could, he poured the last of his canteen over her lips. She didn't wake, but her throat moved, swallowing what little moisture he offered. Then, without a word, he lifted her into his arms. She was lighter than expected, like someone half erased. He placed her carefully across his saddle, mounted behind her, and turned his horse toward home. As they rode, the sun began to sink behind the hills, casting long shadows across the dust. In the silence, Jedediah Cain did not wonder who she was or why she had been left behind. He only wondered if he had found her in time. If you found this helpful, a quick like really helps us keep creating. The first night, she moaned in her sleep. Jedediah Cain didn't startle easy, but the sound, that low, cracked whisper of pain, cut deeper than he expected. She lay twisted in his only bed, the covers tangled around her legs, her brow slick with fever. He sat beside her, elbows on knees, listening as she murmured a name, Mama, and then a prayer that came out broken, as if torn from the remnants of a faith long buried. The venom was cruel, and so was the sunburn. He had done what he could, sliced shallow, drew what poison he could from the wound, then packed it with mashed yarrow and cold clay. Still, her leg had swelled to nearly twice its size, mottled with angry reds and deep splotchy purple. The fever that followed came like a wave and didn't let go. He worked in silence, boiled willow bark into a bitter tea, steeped mint leaves to cool her breath, soaked cloth in creek water and laid it across her forehead. Every few hours he lifted her gently. She was light as linen, and helped her sip a few drops of broth, her throat barely responding. She'd shiver, then burn, shiver, then burn again. He didn't speak to her, not out of coldness, but because he didn't know what words would help. Besides, silence had always been his companion, and in some ways it felt like Ruth was still here, in the way the room smelled faintly of time, or how the curtains swayed gently even with the windows closed. On one point, in the dead of night, Clara jerked awake in her fever. Her eyes flared open but saw nothing. She whispered, "Don't leave me again." Jed touched her wrist, not to hold, just to ground her, and said, voice low and steady, "I won't." He settled after that. He sat by the bed until the candle burned low. Its flame, dancing like it too, was trying to last through the darkness. On the third day, the fever finally broke. He knew the moment her breathing changed. It no longer came in shallow, frantic gasps, but in longer, deeper pulls. Her body, though still pale and weak, no longer twitched in pain. Her hands, which had clenched and grasped invisible shapes in the air, now lay still at her sides. Jed watched her sleep for a while longer, letting the silence fill in what words couldn't say. Outside, the sky was just beginning to pale, streaked with soft pinks and thin early gold. He stepped out to fetch fresh water, and by the time he returned, she was awake. Barely. Her eyes opened slowly, like they'd forgotten how, and her lips parted. He offered her a tin cup of cool water. She took it in both hands, trembling but determined, and drank. Her voice, when it came, was a whisper laced with disbelief. "You stayed?" Jed didn't nod, didn't smile. He only said, "You needed someone." And in the quiet of that morning, under the fading chill of the desert night, Clara Whitlow, who had been left to die beneath an unflinching sun, was still alive. By the 5th day, Clara was sitting up. By the 6th, she insisted on walking. Jed had tried to stop her, gently, with a hand hovering near her shoulder, but she shook her head. "I need to move," she said, her voice rasped but sure, and she did. Like a foal learning its legs again, she shuffled from cot to chair, then to the open doorway, her bare feet careful on the worn wooden floor. The desert air greeted her like a stranger, not cruel this time, but cautious, hot but dry, brushing her skin like it, too, was learning how to welcome her back. Outside the cabin, life ticked on in small ways. A goat bleated from the pen. The wind tugged at the corners of a tacked-down canvas. The scent of sun-warmed cedar and dry earth floated around her, grounding, real. That afternoon, Clara found Jed's sewing kit tucked into a box on a high shelf, beside a folded handkerchief edged with delicate white embroidery. She recognized the touch of a woman's hands, careful, loving, patient. Ruth's. Her own dress had ripped down the side, torn when she fell, blood-stained near the hem. She didn't ask permission. She simply sat on the porch with the basket in her lap and began to stitch. Jed returned from checking the fence line to find her there, head bowed over the faded fabric, the long thread rising and falling like a quiet hymn. He stopped on the top step, dusty and still, and didn't say a word. "She had a good hand," Clara said softly, not looking up. Jed exhaled slowly. "She did." They didn't speak again for a while. She sewed, he leaned against the post. The desert, in its infinite patience, stretched out around them like a great sleeping animal. That evening, Clara insisted on helping with dinner. Her steps were slow, but her hands were steady. She peeled potatoes, stirred beans, added salt by feel rather than measure. Jed watched from the table, his book open but unread. Later, as she set 2 bowls down, she said, "I'm not trying to take her place." Jed looked at her, then down at the steam rising from the stew. "I didn't think you were." She nodded. I need to feel useful again." There was nothing dramatic in the moment. No speeches, no sudden tears, just the clink of spoons, the sound of crickets beginning their evening chorus, and the crackle of firelight in the hearth. After the meal, she rinsed the dishes while he chopped wood outside. She left the mended dress folded at the end of his bed. And for the first time since she'd arrived, Clara slept through the night without dreams. It was the kind of evening that came quietly, like a letter slipped under the door. No wind, no sudden shift of light, just the slow fading of sun from the window panes and the hush that settled over everything, like a prayer not meant to be spoken aloud. Jed sat on the porch, sharpening a small knife, the rhythmic scrape of stone against steel the only sound. Clara emerged from the cabin, cradling 2 cups of chicory brew. She handed one to him without a word, then lowered herself onto the step beside him. They sat like that for a while, just drinking, just listening. The desert didn't hum or whisper, it simply watched. "I never thought I'd miss Missouri," she said at last. Her voice was low, almost self-mocking. "Too many storms, too many nosy neighbors." Jed didn't laugh, but the corner of his mouth tugged. "Storms I can handle. People, too, if they know when to shut up." Clara looked out toward the horizon, where the light still clung in streaks of orange and ash. "He wasn't always cruel," she said. "Elias. There were days. I think he wanted to be better. But wanting ain't the same as being." Jed was silent. He let her speak, and that was the gift. Clara continued, slower now. "It started small, little things. He'd get angry when I read too long at night, said it made me distant. He'd throw a book. Then he started throwing words. After a while, he threw his hands." Jed's hand tightened slightly around his cup, but he said nothing. "I stopped reading," she added, "stopped writing letters, stopped looking people in the eye." She paused, as if weighing whether to speak the next part. Then, "He made me smaller, and I let him." Jed didn't offer comfort, didn't murmur cliches. He just let the weight of her words settle between them, honored them with his silence. After a while, she glanced sideways. "What about you, Ruth? You loved her." It wasn't a question. It didn't need to be. Jed's eyes stayed on the horizon. "She used to talk to the chickens," he said after a long pause. "Named 'em, too. One was Ezekiel, real mean rooster. She swore he had opinions about everything." Clara laughed, startled by it, warm and unexpected. "She died in the fall," he said, the words flat but not bitter. "Fever took her fast. Too fast to make sense of. By the time I realized how bad it was, she was already gone." He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a small, worn square of cloth, a handkerchief with faded embroidery along the edge. "She stitched this the week before she passed, said we'd have something to pass down. I told her we weren't likely to have anyone to pass it to." His thumb rubbed gently over the threadwork. She said, "You never know." Clara didn't reach for it. She didn't need to. Some things were sacred by distance. Instead, she said, "She sounds like someone who believed things could be mended." Jed nodded once. She did. They sat until the stars came out, quiet but not lonely. And when Clara finally stood to go inside, she left her cup beside his, not in front of him, not beside his boot, but directly next to his. as if, from now on, things might come in pairs again. Morning came with a hush, as if even the sun knew not to disturb the fragile peace that had begun to settle over the small homestead. Clara woke slowly, her body still sore but not broken. The fever had left her lightheaded, but her thoughts, for the first time in days, felt clear. Outside the window, the wind moved through the mesquite like a gentle reminder that life went on, whether you were ready or not. She moved through the cabin quietly, letting Jed sleep. He'd taken to the floor the last few nights, never complaining. She found a tin basin and splashed her face, gasping slightly at the chill. Then, as she reached to return the cloth, she noticed the drawer beside the bed, ajar by an inch. It wasn't snooping, at least that's what she told herself. Inside lay a small leather-bound book, its corners softened by years, its spine cracked and bowed. She recognized it instantly, the Psalms. She hesitated, then lifted it with both hands, as if it might crumble. Opening it, she found a pressed flower between two pages, faded, brittle, but still whole. The page was Psalm 139. Her eyes landed on a single verse. Even the darkness will not be dark to you. The night will shine like the day, for darkness is as light to you. She stared at it, throat tightening. How long had it been since she read those words, since she believed them? Elias had called it weakness, clinging to Scripture like a child with a blanket. He said God was for fools who couldn't face the world as it was. After a while, she stopped praying. Not because she didn't believe, but because she couldn't bear the silence that came after. But here, in this place that smelled of cedar and old bread, where a man who had lost everything still chose to offer kindness without asking why, something inside her stirred. Later that afternoon, she brought the book outside and sat near the stump where Jed was mending a gate hinge. "You still read this?" she asked, not accusingly. Jed glanced over, wiped sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. "Not as much as I should." "She marked it," Clara said, tapping the folded page. He nodded. "Ruth. Used to copy verses onto scrap wood. Said if the house ever burned, she wanted God's word to go up with it." Clara smiled faintly. "That's either deeply faithful or slightly mad." "Maybe both," Jed replied. She ran her fingers over the edge of the page. "This verse, I used to whisper it at night, when I was scared." "You scared now?" he asked, not teasing. "No," she said, almost surprised at herself. "Not right now." There was a long pause, wind in the trees, a bird's cry in the distance. Then Jed said, "Sometimes peace sneaks in when you ain't looking for it." Clara nodded, her hand still resting on the page. And for the first time in what felt like years, she closed her eyes, not to shut out the world, but to let something in. The days passed like drifting leaves, quiet, unhurried, steady. Clara rose earlier now. She moved without the stiffness of recovery, though the ache in her legs still whispered with each step. There was a rhythm to the mornings. Feed the goats, fetch water, sort herbs on the porch rail while the sun climbed over the distant hills. Jed never said much, but he began leaving things where she could find them. A jar of honey beside her teacup, a folded apron, washed and pressed, a sprig of rosemary on the windowsill, its scent sharp and calming. In return, Clara cooked more than stew. She baked biscuits, seasoned beans the way her mother used to, and once even made peach preserves from a jar long forgotten in the pantry. The cabin didn't feel like it belonged to someone else anymore. It didn't feel borrowed. It felt lived in, shared. One afternoon, as Jed worked on repairing the back gate, Clara knelt in the garden patch Ruth had once planted. The soil was stubborn, but not dead. With patience, she coaxed green life from beneath its dry skin. Lettuce, wild onions, a few struggling tomato sprouts. Her hands, stained with earth, looked stronger now, not soft or girlish, capable. She wiped them on her skirt and leaned back, studying the rows. Straight, honest, growing. Behind her, Jed approached, wiping his palms on his trousers. "You've got a good touch," he said. She looked over her shoulder. "It's mostly remembering what not to do." He gave a small nod. Still, Ruth couldn't get onions to behave. They'd bolt on her every time. Clara smiled. Maybe they needed someone with a little more stubbornness. A pause, a quiet one, full but comfortable. Then Jed said, "Winters get cold out here." Clara didn't answer right away. She plucked a stray weed from the row and placed it in the basket beside her. "I've weathered worse." He didn't push, just stood there, hands at his sides, the silence between them like an old quilt, worn, familiar, warm. That evening, after dinner, Clara brought out her sewing kit again. One of Jed's shirts had torn at the collar. She mended it at the table while he sat nearby, whittling a new handle for his axe. He watched her fingers move, quick and practiced. "She used to do that," he said quietly. Clara didn't ask who he meant. "She must have had good eyes. This thread's nearly invisible." "She did," Jed said. Then, after a beat, but her hands shook near the end. Clara set down the needle. "Would you mind if I wore the apron she made?" Jed looked up, startled, not by the request, but by how natural it felt. "No," he said, "I think she'd like that." That night, Clara hung the apron on the back of the door. It swayed slightly when she passed, as if catching her scent, welcoming her. She stood for a long moment, hand resting on the fabric. And in that stillness, she realized this wasn't a place she was passing through. It was a place where peace had begun to grow. If you're still watching right now, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're still with me on this journey. The afternoon sun lay low over the homestead, as if indifferent to the tension creeping into the air. Clara stood in the doorway, one hand brushing the threshold, the other light at her side. Jed stood just behind her, quiet, his posture steady, grounded like the wood beneath his boots. From the dusty lane came the rattle of hooves and the creak of a wagon wheel. Clara's heart skipped, not with surprise, but a sharp recognition of something she had long buried. She turned her head, and there, on the horizon's dusty trail, was Elias. His face framed by the rim of the sheriff's hat, but unmistakable. The man who had left her to die. He rode with deliberate calm, as if announcing a return to a contract already expired. The sheriff, boot-shined and stern, sat beside him, expression neutral, weighing his own role in the scene. Elias lifted a hand, a practiced gesture of concern. "I thought you were dead," he said when he dismounted, voice smooth, as if recalling rehearsed lines. Clara exhaled silently. The breath was not fear. It was control. She stepped forward into full light, no longer the shrinking woman of a few weeks ago. The heat caught the sheen of sweat on her forehead, but she stood rooted. Jed shifted his weight, the subtle sound of boot hitting plank resonating in the silence. His hand hovered near the knife at his belt, not as threat, but as warning. No words were spoken. Clara's eyes rested directly on Elias's, steady, unwavering. The theta of truth in her gaze was all the defense she needed. The sheriff cleared his throat softly. His eyes flicked from Clara to Elias. "Ma'am, we heard you were dead," he said at last, voice trailing off under the weight of the moment. Clara's response was simple, clear. "I was left." Silence settled like a curtain. The desert seemed to lean in, listening. Elias took a step forward. Jed stepped down from the porch at the same time, silent, firm. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His body stood between Clara and the man who once called her his. A boundary had been drawn in the dust, and it was alive in the space Jed claimed. Elias raised both hands, mock surprise in his grin. "Easy, stranger. I came here for my wife, not a fight." Jed's eyes didn't leave him. "She ain't yours." Those words, simple and steady, cut sharper than any blade. Not because they were loud, but because they were true. Because they came from a man who did not seek to possess, only to protect. Clara stepped to Jed's side. Her voice was low, even, the edge of steel just beneath the calm. "Elias Vane left me dying in the dust. He saw the snakebite, saw the swelling, and walked away with the water and the money." The sheriff looked between them, his brow knitting. "That true?" he asked, but the tone in his voice said he already knew. Elias scoffed, trying to laugh, but it rang false. "She's confused. Heat, maybe? Grief? You think I'd abandon my wife?" Jed's voice cut in like gravel beneath a wheel. "Don't matter what I think. Matters what she says, and I believe her." The wind stirred. A tumbleweed rolled past like some old ghost. Elias's face darkened. "You plannin' to keep another man's wife, Blackwood?" Jed's jaw worked once. Then he said, slow and firm, "She's not property." The sheriff shifted. Jed looked to him just once and added, "You come here for justice, you'd best know who's still human in this mess, and who gave that up the moment he walked east." The silence that followed was heavy, but not empty. It brimmed with judgment, not loud, but righteous. Clara stepped forward, not rushed, not frantic. Each movement was measured, deliberate, like a woman who'd rehearsed this moment every night since she'd nearly died. The sheriff looked at her, waiting. "I remember it all," Clara said. Her voice didn't shake. It rang quiet but sure, like the crack of ice in deep water. "The sound the snake made, the way the venom burned through my leg. I remember calling his name, once, just once." She didn't look at Elias as she spoke. She looked at the sheriff. "I remember the heat, the dust, and the silence when he didn't come back." Elias shifted on his boots. She was delirious. "I wasn't delirious when you walked away with my mother's locket." Her voice was sharper now, slicing through his interruption. "Silver, oval, it had my parents' picture inside. You reached into my apron as I cried and took it." Elias blinked, caught off guard, not by the accusation, but by the detail. Clara turned to Jed, who hadn't moved from his post. "Jed," she said softly, "in the drawer, the one by the hearth." He didn't ask. He walked back inside. The room swallowed him for a moment. Then he returned, holding a small pouch in his hand. Inside, on a strip of calico cloth, lay the silver locket. Jed handed it to Clara. She held it like a relic, then extended it toward the sheriff. "This was in his pocket," she said. "When he left me, he took everything worth money. The last of the water, the last coin, and this, the only thing I had left from my family." The sheriff took the locket, opened it, stared at the tiny photographs inside. One of them cracked with age, the other yellowed from the desert sun. His face changed. Just a shade, but enough. Elias's voice was quieter now. You must have dropped it." "No," Jed said flatly. "He had it when I found her. Same coat he's wearing now." The silence that followed wasn't uncertain. It was final. The desert did not roar. It did not scream. But its quiet justice fell like a gavel. Sheriff McClary held the locket in his hands for a long moment. The desert heat shimmered around them, but the stillness was colder than wind. He looked at Clara. Her face was streaked with dust and old hurt, but her eyes held no fear, only truth. Truth that had waited too long to be heard. Then he turned to Elias. "Well," the sheriff asked, but not as an invitation, more like a test. Elias straightened, lifting his chin like a man on stage. "It's easy to twist things when your mind's been cooked by fever. She's got a new protector now, that's clear enough." "I'm the husband. I got papers. You gonna let some stranger take her just 'cause she got stories?" The sheriff squinted. "You filed her as deceased." Elias faltered. I thought she was, I swear it." Clara said nothing. She didn't need to. Jed finally spoke. His voice wasn't loud, but it rolled deep and gravel true. "The law don't always know the truth when it sees it, but people do." Elias sneered. "Who are you to talk law?" Jed didn't blink. "I ain't talking law." He looked at the sheriff. His words were slow, like stones laid careful on a grave. "The law ain't mercy, but the truth is." It was not a clever line. It was not shouted. But in the still air, it landed like thunder. The sheriff's jaw tensed. He looked again at Elias, too smooth, too polished, too timed. A man who'd rehearsed regret like a show tune. Then he looked at Jed, stoic, dust-covered, hands worn but steady. And Clara, silent, sure, not pleading but declaring. The wind sighed through the mesquite. A hawk cried somewhere high. "I swore to uphold the law," the sheriff said finally. "But sometimes the law ain't fast enough or kind enough. So I reckon I best be sure I'm walking alongside the truth." He clicked the locket shut with a snap. "Elias Vane, you'll come with me. We'll have a talk back in town about false reports, theft, and maybe worse." Elias opened his mouth to argue, but the sheriff had already turned. The sheriff didn't wait for more excuses. He stepped back toward the buggy, gesturing at Elias with two fingers. "Come on, Vane. You and I got some paperwork to rewrite." Elias didn't move. His eyes darted to Clara, to Jed, then back to the sheriff, as if somewhere in those faces he might still find a way out. "You're making a mistake," he spat. "She's confused. Poison, sun, whatever he fed her. I'm her husband." Clara finally met his gaze, but there was no hatred in her eyes, just quiet pity. "You were," she said. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Jed remained still. He hadn't moved an inch since Clara spoke. He didn't look at Elias. He didn't threaten. He simply stood, a wall between past and present. A silence settled over the yard, the kind of silence that came not from fear, but from finality. "Move," the sheriff said. Elias hesitated too long. Jed shifted slightly, not even a full step, just enough to let the butt of his revolver show beneath his duster. That did it. Elias climbed into the buggy with stiff limbs, like a man crawling into a box he'd built for himself. Sheriff McClary tipped his hat at Clara. "Ma'am," he said simply. At Jed, a longer look. Respect. Understanding. Then the buggy turned. Its wheels kicked up a ribbon of dust down the road they'd all come from. Nobody spoke. They listened to the buggy grow smaller, to the dust settle, to the hawk overhead grow distant, and then just stillness. Clara let out a breath she hadn't known she'd been holding. Her shoulders slumped, but not in defeat, only in release. Jed turned toward her. He didn't speak, didn't ask if she was all right. He simply stood beside her. Not to protect, not to comfort, just to be there. When the sound of the wheels faded into nothing, Clara's knees gave way. She didn't fall dramatically, didn't sob or scream. She simply lowered herself down, step by step, to the porch, as if every breath she'd held since the desert had finally slipped free. Her hands trembled in her lap, not from fear, from the weight of survival. Jed sat down beside her, slow and steady. He didn't reach for her. Just sat, close enough to share warmth, far enough to let her choose. The horizon glowed gold and rust, the kind of light that feels like it's been earned. Clara stared at it. Her voice came like dry leaves brushing across a wooden floor. "It should feel louder," she said. Jed didn't answer. "I thought, when it was over, I'd want to scream, or cry, or curse the sky." She looked down at her hands. Strong hands, soil-stained and calloused now. Not the hands of the woman who'd once begged a cruel man for a sip of water. "But all I feel is tired." Jed finally spoke. "That's what peace feels like, sometimes, after a long war." The wind stirred the porch, the scent of cedar and old leather. She turned her head. He was looking at the horizon too, not at her, giving her space, giving her choice. But in the set of his shoulders, in the way his hands rested, there was a promise. No chains, no expectations, just presence. She reached out, slowly, deliberately. Her fingers brushed his. Rough skin met rough skin. No fireworks, just warmth. And when his hand turned to clasp hers, it wasn't possession, it was partnership. The silence between them deepened, but it no longer held fear. It held understanding. Out there, the desert still stretched wild and wide. But here, on this porch, under the bruised sky and the weight of a day finally set right, two people sat. Not as survivors clinging to what was lost, but as souls who had found what truly mattered. If you like this video, please comment number 9. If you don't like it, please comment number 0. The garden had been bare for years. Not dead exactly, just waiting. The soil was cracked but not lifeless. It silenced the kind that held room for memory, and maybe, just maybe, something new. Clara stepped into it barefoot, the hem of her worn cotton dress brushing her ankles. The morning sun warmed her shoulders. It was the first time she had stood in this patch of earth, not as a guest, not as a fugitive, but as a woman with her own breath, her own will. The hoe was heavier than she remembered tools to be, but her hands, though still healing, gripped it with purpose. She began to clear the weeds that had grown wild over what used to be neat rows. She worked slowly, methodically, each movement carrying a kind of reverence. There was something holy in returning life to what had been neglected. The wind carried no voice, no command, just quiet encouragement. A bird sang from the fence post, its call clear and piercing against the stillness. Clara paused and looked up. The bird cocked its head, as if to say, "Keep going." She dropped to her knees and pressed her fingers into the soil. It was warm, soft, just beneath the surface, like skin that had been waiting to be touched. With care, she planted seeds from a small pouch Jed had handed her that morning, without a word, seeds saved from Martha's old box. There had been no explanation, only the weight of trust in the gesture. As she covered the seeds, her fingers lingered. She thought of the nights she had nearly died of fever, of the way Jed never asked for thanks, only brewed broth and sat beside her when she cried in her sleep. He never told her she was safe, but he made her feel it. Now, in this act of planting, she felt something unexpected take root inside her. Stability. Not joy, not yet, but something firmer than fear. Not the desperate hope she had once clung to like splinters in a storm, but a quiet conviction that life could start again. Behind her, the door creaked. She didn't turn. She knew it was Jed. She sensed his gaze on her back, not intrusive, just present, a steady warmth. He didn't speak, neither did she. But that, too, was a kind of language between them now. The garden was not yet beautiful. It was patchy, uneven, full of the scars of neglect. But it was hers, it was theirs, and it was beginning. Clara sat back on her heels and looked at her hands. They were dirty, cracked, and calloused, but strong. They did not shake, they did not hide. She let the morning fill her lungs. The scent of moist soil, the rustle of dry leaves, the faint scent of coffee from inside the cabin. It was all part of a new liturgy. Her life no longer followed the frantic rhythm of survival. It had its own tempo now, shaped by kindness, by care, by choice. In the corner of the garden, a tiny sprout had broken through. She smiled, not at its size, but at its audacity. Behind her, Jed's footsteps retreated softly into the house, still without a word. But she knew, and that was enough. Evening fell like a soft blanket over the hills. The sky brushed in quiet shades of lavender and gold. The porch creaked gently as Clara stepped out, a cup of lukewarm tea in her hands. Jed sat where he always did in the evenings, one boot propped on the railing, a worn book open on his knee, though he hadn't turned a page in 10 minutes. They sat in companionable silence, listening to the wind move through the trees. Far in the distance, a coyote called out, a long, lonely sound that echoed across the open land. It didn't sound threatening tonight. It sounded like someone remembering a song they used to know. Clara sipped her tea, then set it down. She clasped her hands, watching the light retreat from the field. "I've been thinking," she said softly. Jed didn't move, but he was listening. "All my life, I never stayed anywhere long. Even when I did, I always felt like I was waiting to leave, waiting for something to fall apart, or someone." He nodded slightly, still looking out. "But this morning, I was in the garden, and I didn't feel that." She paused, searching for the words. "I felt quiet, not empty, just still, like my soul wasn't running anymore." She turned to him, her voice barely more than breath. "Jedediah, I have nowhere to go." He didn't look at her right away. He let the silence stretch a moment longer, not out of hesitation, but reverence. When he did turn, his gray eyes held no surprise, just truth. "You don't need to go," he said. "You're already home." The words weren't dramatic. They didn't arrive with swelling music or a kiss. They landed like a feather, but one soaked in everything they had survived. Clara exhaled. She didn't cry. She just let go. She reached for his hand, this time without hesitation. He took it, steady as ever. They stayed that way until the stars began to blink into the sky, one by one, as if even heaven was taking its time tonight. Jed squeezed her hand once, a quiet promise. Tomorrow they'd plant more, repair more, maybe rebuild the chicken coop, maybe not. There'd be time. For now, there was this, the hush of twilight, the weight of a shared silence, the warmth of a hand held without ownership. And in that moment, Clara understood what home really was. Not four walls, not even safety, but a place where you are no longer surviving alone, where someone sees you, stays, listens, where your name is spoken like it matters, and maybe, just maybe, where grace can take root. Step into the forgotten corners of the West, where love blooms in silence and redemption rides with the dusk. Our Western Love Stories series tells quiet tales of grace, grit, and second chances, crafted to touch the soul, stir old memories, and remind you some stories heal by whispering, not shouting.